They shot his wife. During a midnight raid, unaware he was Special Forces trained. The house stood quiet on the edge of the neighborhood, wrapped in the kind of silence that usually brought peace after a long day. Ethan had always loved nights like this. He believed they reminded him of why he had left his old life behind. The world outside could be chaotic, filled with problems and dangers he had once known too well. But inside these four walls he had found something sacred: family, love, and a sense of belonging. Maria sat on the couch, leaning against Ethan's shoulder, her laughter soft and light. They had spent the evening together, talking about their day, their plans for the future, and silly little things that only made sense to the two of them. For Ethan, those small, quiet moments were the most valuable treasures of life. He did not need wealth, he did not crave recognition. He only needed her by his side. But peace has a strange way of ending when you least expect it. It began with a faint sound, so small it might have been the wind knocking a loose branch against the window. Ethan's instincts, however, were sharper than most. Years of training had taught him that not every sound was harmless. He stiffened, his ears tuning in while Maria looked up at him, sensing the sudden change in his body language. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He smiled gently, trying not to alarm her. "Probably nothing. I'll check." But before he could rise, the world shifted. A deafening crash shattered the stillness as the front door burst open. Masked figures stormed inside with heavy boots and shouting voices. They carried weapons, and their movements were quick, sharp, and violent. The once safe home instantly became a battlefield. Maria screamed, clinging to Ethan's arm. He pushed her behind him instinctively, his mind calculating, his muscles tightening. He had faced ambushes before, but never like this. Not in his home. Not with the person he loved most standing in the line of fire. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice calm but firm. The intruders barked orders, their weapons raised. The leader, a tall man with a rough voice, shouted for Ethan to get on the ground. They thought they had power, that their masks and guns made them unstoppable. But they did not know who they were facing. Ethan did not move immediately. His eyes darted to every corner of the room, analyzing positions, exits, and possible counters. It was automatic for him, the way his mind mapped danger. But Maria's hand gripping his arm brought him back to the reality of the moment. She was scared, trembling, her eyes filled with fear. For her, he had to be more than a soldier. He had to be her protector. "Please," Maria whispered, "do what they say." Ethan nodded slowly, his body lowering to the ground, but his mind stayed alert. He knew compliance was not safety. Men like these did not break into homes at midnight to leave witnesses alive. And then it happened. A gunshot thundered in the living room, so loud it made the walls shake. Maria gasped sharply, her body jolting backward. Ethan's eyes widened as he caught her before she collapsed, his arms wrapping around her limp frame. The world blurred. Her blood was warm against his hands, and her face, once full of laughter, now carried pain and shock. "No." His voice tore through the chaos, raw and desperate. The intruders did not care. They shouted again, threatening him, ordering him to put her down. But Ethan barely heard them. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than their voices, louder than anything else. The woman he had promised to protect, the love of his life, had just been torn away from him in an instant of brutality. He pressed his hand against the wound, whispering to her, begging her to hold on. "Stay with me, Maria, stay with me. Please, just breathe." Her eyes fluttered weakly, tears sliding down her face. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The sight of her suffering cut deeper into Ethan than any wound ever had. Something inside him snapped, not in panic, not in fear, but in resolve. The men thought they were in control. They thought Ethan was just another helpless civilian who would break under their threats. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Years ago, Ethan had been more than just a soldier. He had been trained in Special Forces, a man who had survived missions no one thought possible. He had lived through ambushes in faraway lands, stared death in the eye, and fought enemies who outnumbered him 100-1. He had buried that part of himself, choosing love over war. But tonight, they had woken the warrior he had promised never to become again. As he held Maria, rage and grief fused into one unshakable force inside him. His mind was no longer clouded. It was clear, sharp, and deadly. Every breath he took reminded him of his purpose, not just to survive, but to fight for the woman in his arms. He looked up at the intruders, his eyes cold and unflinching. In that moment, he was no longer the man they thought they had broken. He was something far more dangerous. The leader barked another order, but for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. He had seen the change in Ethan's eyes. The fearlessness, the quiet strength, the kind of presence only a man who had walked through fire could carry. Ethan rose slowly, still cradling Maria. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a warning that chilled the room. "You have no idea what you've done." The intruders shifted uneasily. Their guns were still raised, but their confidence had cracked. They had expected panic, not defiance. They had expected a broken man, not a storm waiting to break loose. Maria's soft breath against his chest reminded him of what mattered. She was alive but fading. He had seconds to make choices that would decide both their futures. And he knew one thing for certain: he could not fail her. The night that began as peaceful had turned into war. And Ethan, though he had tried to bury that part of his life, was once again the soldier the world had once feared. The midnight raid was not over. It had only just begun. Ethan's arms tightened around Maria's fragile body. Her breath was shallow, uneven, and every second felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. He could hear the intruders moving around him, their boots pressing heavily against the floorboards, their voices sharp with orders and curses. But for Ethan, their noise faded into the background. All he could focus on was Maria, the woman who had given his life meaning after years of shadows. Her blood stained his shirt, warm against his skin. He pressed his hand harder against the wound, whispering to her even as his throat burned, "You are not leaving me." "Not like this. Hold on, Maria, just hold on." But grief was a dangerous thing. It had a way of twisting into something unshakable, something far stronger than fear. Ethan had felt grief before. He had lost friends on battlefields across the world. But nothing, not even the cruelest war, compared to the pain of seeing Maria like this. This was not just his wife. She was his anchor, his reason for walking away from violence, the person who made him believe in peace again. And they had tried to take her from him. One of the masked intruders stepped closer, aiming his weapon. "Get away from her now!" Ethan did not move. His eyes flickered up slowly, calm yet piercing. The man's finger trembled on the trigger, but he hesitated. There was something unsettling in Ethan's stare, something that spoke of experience far beyond that of a normal man. The leader barked louder, his voice carrying frustration. "You think you're brave? You think we won't shoot you next?" Still, Ethan remained steady, his body unmoving except for the slight shift as he shielded Maria with his frame. He had been trained never to show fear, never to let the enemy sense weakness. And right now, his silence, his defiance, was more terrifying to them than shouting could ever be. Inside him, however, a storm raged. He wanted to scream. He wanted to let out the fire burning inside, but he knew better. Rage without control was useless. Discipline, that was what kept a soldier alive. And Ethan had been forged in discipline, tested in fire. Slowly, he shifted Maria's weight, laying her gently against the couch cushions. Her eyes fluttered weakly open for a moment, and she whispered, barely audible, "Don't leave me," her voice shattered him. He touched her cheek softly, his calloused hand trembling. "Never, I'll never leave you." And then he stood. It was a slow, deliberate motion, one that drew the intruders' attention instantly. Two of them raised their weapons higher, their eyes narrowing behind their masks. "What are you doing?" one shouted nervously. Ethan's voice was steady, cold and low. "You came into the wrong house." His words hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to cut through their false confidence. The men glanced at each other, unsettled by the lack of fear in his tone. They did not know that Ethan had spent years in places where death was a daily visitor. They did not know that he had learned to fight with nothing but his hands, his mind, and his will. They did not know that the man before them had been shaped by missions the world would never hear about. Missions where hesitation meant death, but they were about to find out. The leader stepped forward, his frustration rising. He pressed his gun toward Ethan's chest just inches away. "You don't scare me. Sit back down before I put you in the ground." Ethan's eyes locked on his. "Try." The room froze. Even the air seemed to pause. In that moment, Ethan was no longer a grieving husband on his knees. He was a soldier again, not because he wanted to be, but because he had no choice. The people who had broken into his home had crossed a line they could never uncross. His muscles tensed, years of training awakening like a long dormant beast. He measured the distance, one step, one strike, one motion. He calculated the positions of the other men, their weapons, their weak points. He could see the fear growing in their eyes, though they tried to mask it behind their guns. And then he smiled, just slightly, just enough for them to know that something was about to change. The leader's hand twitched, and for a split second his attention shifted. That was all Ethan needed. With the speed of lightning, Ethan's hand shot up, knocking the gun aside as his other fist drove hard into the man's throat. The leader gasped, stumbling back, choking for air. Before the others could react, Ethan grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until the gun clattered to the ground. The intruders shouted, raising their weapons, but Ethan was already moving. He knew hesitation killed, and in that instant he refused to let hesitation own him. He ducked low, using the leader's body as a shield as bullets cracked through the air. The smell of gunpowder filled the living room, but Ethan's mind was clear. Every motion was controlled, precise, and deadly. The breaking point had come. This was no longer about survival. This was about justice, about love, about keeping the one promise he had made the day he married Maria, that he would protect her with his life. The men had woken something they did not understand. They thought they were wolves, but they had stepped into the den of a lion, and Ethan was no ordinary man. He was Special Forces trained. The night was far from over. The real fight had just begun. The room still reeked of gunpowder, the echoes of violence hanging heavy in the air. Ethan stood tall, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and purpose. The intruders had come into his home thinking they had the upper hand, but they were starting to realize the truth. They had woken a man who carried shadows they could not imagine. Maria's faint breathing behind him pulled at his heart, but his mind sharpened with every second. He could not falter now. To save her, he had to draw from a part of himself he had buried long ago. A part of himself he never wanted her to see. Years earlier, long before Ethan had found peace with Maria, he had been another man entirely. A man molded by the military, chosen for missions that demanded more than strength. Missions that demanded silence, precision, and the willingness to walk into places others would not survive. He had been just a young recruit when the Special Forces first noticed him. His endurance, his sharp instincts, his ability to read situations before they unfolded, these set him apart. He learned quickly that war was not won by brute force alone. It was won by patience, discipline, and the courage to act when fear screamed at you to stand still. Training was relentless. Endless days under the burning sun, nights where sleep was only a rumor, and drills that pushed his body past every breaking point. He had been dropped in deserts with no supplies, forced to find water where none seemed to exist. He had been left in forests so dark that every rustle of leaves sounded like death creeping closer. He had been taught to fight with weapons, but more importantly, without them. To turn anything, stones, ropes, even silence, into tools of survival. And in time, Ethan became one of the best. He was not loud, he was not boastful. His strength was quiet, hidden, and efficient. While others panicked under fire, Ethan thrived. He learned to control his breathing, his heartbeat, even his thoughts. Enemies often never saw him coming until it was too late, but along with skill came scars. Ethan carried the weight of missions no one would ever read about in history books. He had lost friends in battles fought in nameless places. He had seen eyes go dim, felt the chill of comrades who would never make it home. Every mission carved something out of him piece by piece, until he began to wonder if there was anything left of the man he used to be. And then he met Maria. She had no idea who he really was when they first crossed paths. To her, he was simply Ethan, a quiet man with gentle eyes and a smile that seemed to carry both sadness and hope. She asked him questions no one had ever asked before. She asked about what he wanted, not what he could endure. She asked about his dreams, not his missions. For the first time in years, he felt human again. Maria became his refuge. With her, laughter returned. He learned the sound of home-cooked meals, of rain tapping against windows, of evenings spent not planning attacks but planning futures. Slowly, she drew the soldier out of the shadows and helped the man step back into the light. Ethan left the uniform behind. He promised himself he would never go back, but promises are fragile when the past is not finished with you. The masked intruders pacing around his living room did not know this history. To them, he was just another man, another target. They thought fear would bend him. They thought pain would silence him. They thought blood would break him. But Ethan was not a man who broke. He was a man who adapted, who endured, who survived. One of the intruders sneered, perhaps trying to mask his unease. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing without your wife. We'll finish this and you'll be begging before the end." Ethan's jaw tightened. They had already taken too much from him tonight. They had already spilled the blood of the only person who mattered, and now they dared to underestimate him. His voice was calm, but it cut through the room like a blade. "I have been through worse than anything you can imagine. You don't scare me. You don't even understand the kind of man you're dealing with." The men shifted nervously, their confidence slipping. There was something in the way Ethan spoke that carried weight. Something that told them his words were not empty. Inside his mind, Ethan could almost hear the echoes of his past instructors, the ones who had drilled into him that a soldier's strength came not from hate, but from control. Rage could burn bright, but control turned it into fire that destroyed enemies and saved lives. Tonight, that fire had been reignited. He moved with quiet precision, his steps measured, his breathing steady. Every inch of the room became part of his calculation, the angles of the walls, the weight of the furniture, the distance between him and the armed men. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. It remembered how to strike, how to defend, how to survive. And though Maria had never seen this side of him, Ethan knew she would understand. Because everything he was about to do was not for himself. It was for her, for the life they had built, for the future they still deserved. The intruders were beginning to realize they were not in control. Their voices grew louder, more desperate. They barked at each other, shouted over one another, their guns shaking slightly as they tried to steady their hands. Fear had entered the room, and it was not Ethan's. He had been here before, outnumbered, cornered, counted out. And every time he had risen. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Ethan's hidden past was no longer hidden. It stood with him in that living room, breathing through him, guiding his every thought. The soldier had returned, and the men who thought they had chosen the right house, the right victim, were about to learn the most painful truth of their lives. This was not their battleground. This was Ethan's. The house was no longer a home. It had turned into a battleground. Shattered glass covered the floor. The curtains swayed from the broken windows, and the faint smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. Maria's soft breathing echoed faintly behind Ethan, reminding him why he could not falter. She was alive but slipping. Every second counted. The men thought they had trapped him. Their boots stamped loudly as they spread across the room, their guns aimed steady. But what they could not see, what they could not understand, was that Ethan was already calculating. Every step, every breath, every twitch of their hands was a signal. To them they had numbers. To Ethan they had weaknesses. He had spent years training for moments exactly like this, though he had never expected to face them again in his own living room. His instructors had drilled it into him. The battlefield is never about who has the most weapons, but who controls the rhythm. Control the rhythm and you control the fight. The leader, still coughing from the strike Ethan had delivered earlier, pointed angrily. "End this! Take him down!" But the order carried hesitation. His voice cracked. His men could sense it. Ethan could sense it. Fear had started creeping into their bones. Ethan shifted slightly, his shoulders squaring, his breathing slow and steady. His silence spoke louder than any threat. It was the silence of someone who had seen death before and refused to bow to it. It was the silence of a man who was not afraid to fight. One of the younger intruders, his mask slightly loose, cursed under his breath and charged forward, raising his weapon. He thought he could end it quickly. But speed without precision was a mistake. Ethan moved in a blur, his hand knocking the weapon aside while his knee drove hard into the man's stomach. The intruder collapsed, gasping for air, the weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. The others shouted, stepping back in shock, "Stay back." One of them barked, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. Ethan stood over the fallen man, his eyes locking on the others. "You can still leave," he said quietly. "But if you stay, you'll regret it." His voice was calm, almost too calm, and that terrified them more than shouting would have. Men who had broken into dozens of homes before now hesitated, their confidence draining. They were used to fear, to control, to dominance. But here was a man who refused to give them any of it. Inside Ethan, something long buried was rising. He had wanted to live in peace, to bury the soldier deep within himself, but tonight proved that some parts of a man never truly die. The warrior inside him had been sleeping, but grief and love had shaken it awake. The intruders regrouped, whispering orders between themselves, their weapons twitching in nervous hands. They had numbers, yes, but their unity was cracking. They had expected an easy job, a terrified family, not a man who fought like a ghost out of legend. Ethan's eyes darted to the hallway, to the shadows he knew so well. His home was not just walls and furniture. It was a map he had memorized. Every door, every corner, every blind spot belonged to him, and he would use it all. In his mind, the house became a battlefield. The hallway was a choke point. The living room offered cover. The kitchen's light reflected off steel, distracting vision. Every piece of his environment was a weapon waiting to be used. He moved quickly, grabbing the fallen intruder's weapon and sliding into the shadows. The others spun, trying to track him, their shouts filling the air. But Ethan had vanished. "Where is he?" one hissed nervously. "Spread out." "Don't let him escape," another answered. But it was not Ethan who was trapped. It was them. He emerged suddenly from the hallway, striking fast. A swift blow to one man's wrist sent his gun flying, followed by a brutal shoulder check that sent him crashing into the wall. Another tried to fire, but Ethan ducked low, sweeping his legs and slamming him to the ground. Their shouts turned into cries of panic. The leader, backing toward the door, raised his weapon with trembling hands. His mask could not hide the fear in his voice. "You don't know who we are. If you kill us, you'll bring hell on yourself." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his voice steady and cold. "I've already lived through hell. And you just made the mistake of bringing it to my home." The leader's hands shook. He had faced men who begged, men who screamed, men who cowered. But this was different. This was a man who carried himself like a storm. The others, weakened and scattered, tried to gather themselves, but their movements were clumsy. Fear had taken the rhythm out of their fight, and Ethan seized it completely. He grabbed a nearby lamp, swinging it with precise force against one attacker's head. The man crumpled instantly. Another lunged forward, knife in hand, but Ethan sidestepped smoothly, twisting his arm until the blade fell and the man collapsed with a cry. Every strike, every move, was controlled. Ethan was not just fighting. He was dismantling them piece by piece, showing them what true training, discipline, and purpose looked like. Behind him, Maria groaned faintly, her voice like a fragile thread in the chaos. It pulled at him, reminding him why he could not lose focus. He turned briefly, his heart aching at her pale face, then hardened again. He had to finish this. He had to clear the danger before he could save her. The warrior inside him was fully awake now, and there was no going back. He was not fueled by revenge alone. He was fueled by love, by the unbreakable promise he had made to Maria to protect her no matter what. The leader stumbled back toward the broken door, his men scattered and groaning on the floor. His gun still shook in his hands, but the fight had drained from his eyes. You're not just some guy," he stammered. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and final. "No. I'm the wrong man you chose to cross." The leader turned and ran into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of his failure. The others, too broken to follow, moaned in pain. Ethan stood in the silence that followed, his chest rising and falling, sweat dripping down his brow. The fight was over, but his war was not. He rushed back to Maria, kneeling beside her, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. She was alive, but weak. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering through clenched teeth, "Stay with me. Just stay with me." For a brief moment, his eyes closed, and he felt the weight of everything. The soldier he had tried to bury, the man he had become, the warrior who had just returned. He had thought that part of himself was gone forever. But tonight proved the truth. The warrior was still inside him. Sleeping maybe, but never gone. And now, fully awake, he would not stop until Maria was safe. The silence after the chaos was heavy, almost unbearable. Ethan could hear only his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and Maria's faint, fragile breathing behind him. The intruders who once stormed into his home with confidence now lay scattered across the floor, groaning, defeated, broken by a man they never understood. But Ethan knew better than to think it was over. He had been in too many fights, too many ambushes to ever assume victory came so quickly. The way the leader had run, Retreating instead of dying where he stood was not the end. It was a signal. A retreat meant regrouping, calling for more. This was not finished. Ethan's hands trembled as he pressed gently against Maria's wound again. Her eyes fluttered open just for a second, her lips moving weakly. "Ethan." "I'm here," he whispered, his throat tight. "I'm not going anywhere." Her hand shifted, trying to hold his. Her strength was fading fast, but even in her pain, she trusted him. That trust burned inside him like fuel. He could not let her down, not now. Not ever. He had to think like the soldier again. His home was not safe anymore, it had become a target. If the men returned with more, Maria would be caught in the middle of a war she could not survive. He needed to move her, to protect her. But he also knew he could not run blindly. To protect her, he had to stand his ground. The faint sound of footsteps outside confirmed his fear. The fight was far from over. The leader had not given up. He had called for backup. Ethan's body tensed, his mind sharpening with the instinct he had tried to bury. He scanned the room quickly, analyzing every possible advantage. His military training whispered through his thoughts like a second voice. Control the terrain. Use their fear against them. Strike before they strike you. He stood slowly, his shoulders squaring. His living room, once filled with laughter and peace, was now a battlefield. But it was his battlefield. He knew the corners, the blind spots, the echoes of footsteps across the floorboards. This was his ground, and he would not give it up. The groans of the injured intruders faded as the sound of vehicles pulling up outside filled the air. More men, more weapons. The leader had brought reinforcements. Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Maria, her face pale but calm, as if she still believed in him even while unconscious. That belief steadied him. He could not falter. The front door, already broken from the raid, burst open again. More masked men flooded inside, their shouts cutting through the silence. But unlike before, their steps were slower, more cautious. They had been warned. They had been told there was something dangerous about the man inside. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his posture straight, his breathing steady. He looked like one man against many, but inside he carried the strength of every mission, every trial, every scar. One of the new intruders sneered, raising his weapon. "You should have stayed down. Now you're outnumbered." Ethan's eyes narrowed. His voice was calm, low, and unwavering. "I've been outnumbered before." It never saved them. The words unsettled them. Their eyes darted nervously. They had weapons, yes, but Ethan's presence was different. It was not just defiance, it was certainty. Then it began again. The first shot cracked through the air, splintering wood, but Ethan was already moving. He dove to the side, flipping a small table into cover. Bullets tore through the furniture, but Ethan's mind stayed calm. He waited for the rhythm, the split-second pause between their volleys. When it came, he struck. He rose from cover, aiming the weapon he had taken earlier. His shots were precise, controlled, one to disarm, one to disable. The men staggered, their formation breaking. He advanced forward, his movements sharp and exact, every step calculated. The fight turned into chaos for them, but for Ethan, it was clarity. He was back in the place he knew too well. His body moved like it remembered, like every muscle carried the memory of battles fought long ago. One attacker lunged at him with a knife, but Ethan sidestepped, twisting his arm until the blade clattered away. He drove his elbow hard into the man's chest, dropping him instantly. Another tried to grab him from behind, but Ethan slammed him against the wall, the man's weapon falling uselessly to the ground. The tide of the battle was shifting. What began as an invasion had turned into survival, for them. The leader stood at the doorway, his mask crooked, watching in disbelief as his men fell one by one. This was not the man he had expected to find. This was not just a husband protecting his wife. This was a soldier, a ghost from wars unspoken, he shouted, desperation seeping into his voice. "Shoot him. Don't stop." But fear had already taken over his men. Their hands shook, their aim faltered, and their steps hesitated. Ethan was not just fighting them. He was breaking their will. Every strike he delivered, every movement he made carried the weight of purpose. He was not fighting for glory, not for victory, but for Maria. Every blow was for her survival. Every motion for the promise he had made when he first took her hand, that he would protect her with everything he was. The fight raged on, but Ethan no longer felt outnumbered. He felt in control. He turned the shadows, the broken furniture, even the fear in the air into weapons. The house that had once been their trap was now their prison. One by one, the attackers fell until only the leader remained, standing frozen at the doorway. His gun was still raised, but his hands trembled. He had seen enough to know that pulling the trigger would not save him. Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady and cold. "This ends now." The leader's mask slipped, revealing wide, terrified eyes. He shook his head, stumbling back. You're not just some man." "What are you?" Ethan's reply was simple. "I'm the man you should never have crossed." The leader fled, disappearing into the night once more. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, his body aching, but his resolve unbroken. The battle had turned, but the war was not over. He knew the man would return. Men like him never accepted defeat. But Ethan also knew something else. Tonight had proven that he was not powerless. The warrior inside him, the part he had tried to bury, had risen, and as long as Maria needed him, he would not let it rest. He turned back to her, kneeling beside her once more, his hands trembling as he held hers. She was alive, still breathing, though weaker now. His eyes burned with tears as he whispered, "Hold on, Maria. I've cleared the way. Just hold on for me." The tide of the battle had shifted. What began as their raid had become his stand, and he would not stop until she was safe. The night had been ripped apart by gunfire, shouts, and the sound of bodies crashing against walls and floors. But now, as the echoes faded, silence fell over the house. Not the comforting silence Ethan once loved, but a heavy, suffocating one. The kind of silence that carried scars. Ethan's chest rose and fell as he knelt beside Maria. Her hand was still warm in his, her pulse weak but alive. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering to her with a voice cracked from exhaustion, "You're still here. That's all that matters. Just keep breathing." His living room was a battlefield. Shards of glass reflected the dim light. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the groans of the intruders he had spared faintly filled the air. The fight was over, for now, but Ethan knew better than to think the war had ended. The leader was still out there, regrouping, planning, and men like that did not forget. For the first time since the raid began, Ethan allowed himself a moment of stillness. He sat on the floor beside Maria, holding her hand tightly, his body aching from every strike and every blow. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. He had fought wars in distant lands, survived ambushes, and endured horrors most people could never imagine. But none of that had prepared him for this, for the sight of Maria's blood on his hands, for the sound of her faint breaths that might fade at any second. He had promised her peace. He had promised her a life far away from violence. And tonight, despite all his strength, violence had found them. That truth cut deeper than any wound. The flashing lights of police cars finally broke through the silence, flooding the room with red and blue. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, shouts echoing as they tried to take control of the scene. Ethan did not move. He stayed on the floor with Maria, his eyes fixed on her face, his hand refusing to let go. "Sir, put your hands up." An officer barked. Ethan looked up slowly, his eyes tired but unflinching. They saw the blood on him, the bodies around him, the broken weapons. To them, he looked less like a victim and more like something they could not explain. He raised his hands reluctantly, not because he feared them, but because Maria needed help, not more chaos. "She needs a medic," he said firmly. "Now." The officers hesitated, glancing at one another, unsure of what they were seeing. But then one of them, seeing Maria's pale face, shouted for the paramedics. Ethan stayed where he was, silent, watching as they lifted Maria carefully onto a stretcher. His body tensed as they carried her out, his heart breaking at the thought of being separated from her even for a moment. As the paramedics left, one of the officers crouched in front of him, studying his expression. What happened here? Ethan's eyes hardened. He looked around at the intruders groaning on the floor, at the wreckage of his home, and then back at the officer. His answer was quiet, but it carried weight. "They came for us. They thought we were weak. They thought they could take everything." He paused, his voice tightening. "They were wrong." The officer frowned, unsettled by the cold certainty in Ethan's tone. He wanted more answers, but something in Ethan's eyes warned him not to push. There was history there, a depth he could not reach. As the house emptied of sirens and footsteps, Ethan finally stood. His legs ached, his muscles screamed, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had survived battles like this before, but the difference now was personal. This time it was not about a mission. It was about Maria, and the silence around him carried a cost. He looked at the walls of his home, once filled with photographs and warmth, now scarred by violence. Every broken chair, every shattered glass whispered a reminder. Peace was fragile. He had built a life on the hope that he could escape his past, but tonight had proven that the past never truly let go. The silence after battle was always the hardest. Soldiers called it the cost of silence. The moment when the noise stops and you are left alone with what you have done, with what you have lost, with the faces that haunt you. Ethan felt it now more than ever. He replayed Maria's voice in his head, the way she whispered not to leave her, the way her eyes pleaded even as her strength faded. Those memories would never leave him, and neither would the knowledge that he had nearly lost her. The officers tried to question him again, but Ethan barely heard them. His mind was already elsewhere, at the hospital beside Maria, holding her hand until she woke again. Nothing else mattered. Not the broken bodies of the intruders. Not the fear in the officer's eyes. Not even his own aching wounds. As he stepped outside, the night air hit him, cool and sharp. The stars above seemed distant, uncaring, as if the universe itself had turned its back. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. The silence screamed louder than the gunfire had. He had survived, yes. He had protected Maria, yes. But at what cost? The man he had buried, the warrior he had promised never to awaken again, was now alive inside him, and Ethan knew that once awakened, that part of him could not be silenced so easily. He walked slowly toward the ambulance, his eyes fixed on Maria's face through the glass as the paramedics worked. She was still breathing, still fighting, and that was enough to keep him standing. The cost of silence was heavy, but he would bear it. He always had. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. White walls stretched endlessly, lined with people waiting, hoping, praying. Ethan sat hunched forward in the plastic chair beside Maria's bed, his large hands wrapped carefully around hers. Machines beeped steadily, each sound reminding him that she was still alive. For 2 nights and 2 days he had barely moved. He had not cared about sleep, food, or the bandages wrapped around his own wounds. All that mattered was her. Every time her chest rose with a shallow breath, he silently thanked whatever force still watched over them. Every time her eyelids flickered, he leaned closer, whispering to her that she was not alone. He had always been strong, but this was different. This was not a battlefield. This was love on the edge of loss. And nothing in all his years of training had prepared him for this kind of fight, the fight to wait, to hope, to believe. Doctors came and went, their words technical, their eyes full of uncertainty. They told him she was stable but weak. They told him it would be a long recovery, if her body found the strength to heal. Ethan nodded silently at every update, but inside, his heart screamed. He could defeat armed men, survive ambushes, escape death in deserts and jungles. But here all he could do was sit and hold her hand. On the 3rd morning, as dawn light spilled faintly through the hospital window, Maria's fingers twitched in his. Ethan froze, his breath catching. Slowly her eyes fluttered open. Ethan. Her voice was a fragile whisper, barely a breath. He leaned forward instantly, his throat tight with emotion. I'm here. I'm right here. Her lips curved weakly into the faintest smile. You kept your promise. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He pressed her hand to his forehead, his shoulders shaking as tears he had held back for days finally slipped free. I'll always keep it, he whispered. Always. She looked at him, her eyes tired but full of the same trust she had always given him. For a moment, the machines and tubes faded. The world shrank to just the 2 of them, 2 souls bound by a promise that had survived fire and blood. The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in to check Maria's vitals. Ethan moved aside reluctantly, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. The nurse smiled softly at the sight of his unwavering focus. She had seen many families come and go, but rarely did she see love worn so visibly, like armor. When the nurse left, Maria whispered again, You fought for me. Ethan's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with memory. I fought because I had to, because you are my world. He did not tell her everything, not yet. He did not tell her how the men had begged, how the house had become a war zone, how the soldier inside him had returned in full force. He wanted to protect her from that darkness. But he knew one day she would see it in his eyes, and when that time came, he prayed she would still look at him the same way. Days turned into weeks. Maria grew stronger slowly, her body healing step by step. Ethan stayed beside her through it all. He read to her. He brought her flowers from the small hospital garden. He even learned how to braid her hair when the nurses showed him. To anyone else, he looked like a husband refusing to leave his wife's side. But inside he was also a soldier refusing to surrender. The police came to question him more than once. They wanted answers about the intruders, about how one man could take down so many. Ethan gave them only enough to satisfy. They came into my home. I defended my wife. Nothing more. He knew the truth was heavier than their pens could write. He knew the silence of his past would protect Maria better than any story. One evening, Maria, stronger now, looked at him with curious eyes. Ethan, you were different that night. I remember your eyes. It was like I was seeing a part of you I didn't know. His heart clenched. He had hoped she would not notice, but Maria had always seen through him. He took a long breath. There are things about me, about my past, that I never wanted to bring into our life. I walked away from that world for you, but when they came, I had no choice. That part of me woke up again. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm despite her weakness. And I'm still here, because of you. I don't care what you had to do. I only care that you kept your promise. Her words broke something inside him, not in pain but in release. For years he had carried guilt for the things he had done as a soldier. For years he had wondered if he could ever truly be more than the shadows of his past. But Maria reminded him of the truth. He was not defined by what he had done. He was defined by why he did it. The promise that began on their wedding day, to protect her, to love her, to stand beside her, was stronger than any battle he had ever fought. Weeks later, when Maria finally walked out of the hospital beside him, Ethan felt the weight of the world ease, even if just slightly. Their home was still scarred, but together, they began to rebuild. Neighbors who once saw Ethan as a quiet, ordinary man now looked at him differently, with respect, with awe, with questions they dared not ask. Ethan did not care what they thought. His focus was only Maria. Late one night, sitting together on their repaired porch, Maria leaned against him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Not telling me everything before?" He shook his head slowly. "No, because I wanted our life to be built on peace, not war. I wanted you to know me as a man, not a soldier. But when the time came, I had to let the soldier return. Not for me, for you." She smiled faintly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then I don't regret it either." The stars stretched above them, quiet and endless. Ethan held her hand, feeling the warmth that had nearly been taken from him. The promise lived on, not in words, but in every heartbeat, in every moment of silence that followed. He knew challenges would come again, that shadows might return, but he also knew he was ready. Not because he was trained, not because he was strong, but because love gave him a strength greater than any training ever had. The warrior inside him would never fully sleep again. But maybe that was not a curse. Maybe it was the gift he had been given, the ability to fight not just for missions, but for love, for family, for the promise that defined his life. As the night deepened, Ethan whispered softly into the quiet air, words only Maria could hear. "You're safe, always. That's my promise." And this time it was not just a vow made once. It was a vow renewed, stronger than ever. The war inside him had ended. The promise lived on.